Thank you all for coming for the second talk in this Earth Things Anthropocene Art Talk series. Welcome back to all of those who joined us last week, and hello to all our new guests. I am Francesca. I'm a final year PhD student in History of Art at the University of York. And this series has been organised by myself and Louise. If Louise wanted to say hi.
Hi everyone, I'm Louise, also a final year PhD student at York. Great thanks to Astrida and Stefanie, and welcome everyone. I hope you all enjoy this hour with us.
And once again, I'd like to say a huge thank you to the University of York Centre for Modern Studies and the Leverhulme Centre for Anthropocene Biodiversity, who have kindly supported this series. Apologies for any repetition from last week, but for those of you who didn't join, I'll just give a brief explanation of this series. So we aim to explore contemporary art's interaction with science and technology concerning the relationship between the human and the natural world, scoping humanity within this significant geological instance now known as the Anthropocene, which has such decisive power to change the enormous history and future of this planet. The term is contested as much as it is used, and in this series we hope to explore the colonial, political, historical, technological and social complexities involved in contemporary art's navigation of this terrain from multiple institutional and geographical perspectives. In this talk today, we are honoured to be joined by writer and curator Stefanie Hessler and cultural theorist Astrida Neimanis. Stefanie is the director of Kunsthal Trondheim in Norway, and her work focuses on ecologies and technology from intersectional and queer perspectives, explored in the recent research-based and transdisciplinary exhibition Sex Ecologies in collaboration with the Seed Box and the Environmental Humanities Collaboratory. Alongside the creation of multiple recent exhibitions on the ocean, Stefanie is also the author of Prospecting Ocean, published in 2018, and has edited the books Life Itself from 2016 and Tidalectics, Imagining an Oceanic Worldview Through Art and Science from 2018. Today, we will be hearing more about Stefanie's recent curatorial project, the 17th Memento Biennale, titled Sensing Nature, in Montreal this September. Astrida works at the intersection of feminism and environmental change. Formerly a lecturer in the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney, she has recently joined the University of British Columbia and is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Feminist Environmental Humanities. Her recent book, Bodies of Water, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology, is a landmark text in the Blue Humanities and one I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, as it calls for humans to examine our relationship to oceans, watersheds, and other aquatic life forms from the perspective of our own primarily watery bodies, and our ecological, poetic, and political connections to other bodies of water. She joins us today to discuss her collaborations with researchers and artists and scientists for numerous projects, including the most recent Shanghai Biennale and the 2019 Lofoten Biennale's Kelp Congress. So we will begin with a talk by Stefanie, followed by one from Astrida, and then we should have around 25 to 30 minutes for further discussion and any questions from the audience. During the speakers' presentations, may I kindly ask you to mute yourself and turn off your camera. You can turn your camera back on in the Q&A session if you wish, and any questions that you have can be typed in the chat box, or you can raise your hand, and then when unprompted, you can unmute yourself to ask them, and we will try and get through as many of them as we can. You might have also noticed that we've turned on live transcription for accessibility reasons. If you wish to get rid of this on your screen, there is an option to hide it by clicking the arrow by live transcript. So finally, we are delighted that so many of you are here, and we hope that you enjoy the next hour. So I will now stop sharing my screen and pass over to Stefanie to begin.
Thank you so much, Francesca and Louise, for inviting us, and what a great pairing. I'm so happy to be talking with Astrida today. We saw each other last week, actually, during the opening of the Memento Biennale in Montreal. So Astrida is, I think, the one of the visitors who has already been able to see almost all of the exhibitions. And it's great to have the chance to speak about the exhibitions today. It's the first time that I actually have a chance to reflect on the show in public after it opened. The title of the Biennale is Sensing Nature, and we developed it with a curatorial team consisting of myself, Maud Johnson, Himali Singh Soin, and Camille Georgeson Usher. We are all based in different localities. I am in southern Sapmi in Trondheim. Himali lives in India, in Delhi, as well as in London, UK. And Maud lives in Montreal, Camille in Toronto. So we were able to combine all of our different perspectives and developed a project together. The focus on sensing was particularly important in order to propose other alternative visions to the way that we understand nature that are not based in a sort of distanced cognitive or rational approach, but that take seriously embodied forms of knowing, both from a feminist perspective, but also working with artists from First Nations and other Indigenous artists, and looking at what we can actually learn and develop together in order to build more just futures. We considered the social and environmental justices together in the exhibition. And it was particularly important for us to have these embodied sorts of perspective that offer other forms of knowing that are not only connected to understanding, grasping, or exploiting, but that actually propose that nature is an entity that senses and exists on its own terms that we can never fully know. So like a lover that you get to know over time, you will never fully know nature, but you can still appreciate and respect and love her with her beauty and with her wounds. Water played an important role in the exhibition, both in the works that we exhibited, but also in the curatorial method. Francesca mentioned in the introduction that I've worked previously on a book titled Dialectics, and I also curated an exhibition at the TBA 21 Augarten in Vienna, which then traveled to the Museum of Modern Art in Dubrovnik, Croatia, as well as to the Fresnoy in France. And for this exhibition, I asked the question what our worldviews would be like if they didn't come from land, but if they were based in water and in movement, fluidity, and flux. The idea for that exhibition came from the late poet and historian Kamau Brathwaite, who, through his poetry, developed the term dialectics, and he doesn't describe it so much in his writing himself. Other people have written about it beautifully, but he really developed a certain rhythm in his writing that undoes the pentameter. He says, in fact, that the hurricane doesn't roar in pentameters, and that is more apt to describe realities in the Caribbean that are influenced by migration, by the transatlantic slave trade, but also by weather phenomena and global heating at this moment. And so taking as a starting point water for a way of thinking and feeling and working through exhibitions, which of course Astrida is also doing very much in her writing and has also influenced a lot of my curatorial work. So this kind of thinking and feeling doesn't only apply to artworks or exhibitions dealing explicitly with water, but I actually like to think about it as a way of working and thinking and developing projects together with artists and of course with curators. And to tell you a bit more about what I mean with that, I'm going to share with you a few slides from the current Momenta Biennale. So I won't read this again, but essentially this is the topic of the Biennale, to look at the kind of blurred boundaries between technology and ancestral wisdoms, between land and water, nature and culture, etc. And to vibrate and feel with, speak to, touch land, water, and air with the aim to vibrate together, to feel together, not to understand or exploit. And one of the works that I want to mention today is by Anduki Jordan. It's a work titled Staying with the Trouble, exhibited at the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal. The work consists of 2 screens with videos of underwater scenes, as well as monarch butterflies and other critters who interact with one another and who are shown in a very immersive, beautiful environment. You can see also these little figures in the center. There are robotic creatures in the shape of a sea sponge, but abstracted in a way that move around in this confined area in the space. Dookie refers to them as from her Artificial Stupidity series. So she sort of plays with the idea that, and criticizes the idea that we can find fixes for our current environmental and social crises through technology only, and ask for a deeper structural change instead. Here are some clapping clams that move and a close-up of one of the moving sponges. In Andu K. Jordan's work, humor plays an important role. And so to my mind, she really opens up our ways of how we perceive these other critters and the closer relationship between nature and technology than what we may sometimes think of. One of the new commissions in the exhibition is by Stefanie Hessler and Erin Sedal, 2 artists who researched in 2019, went to the Great Bear Lake, where they conducted research interviews, filmed, did audio recordings, and collected rocks near a uranium mine, which was active in the 1930s, and where Dene communities were employed to work on the extraction of uranium for the Manhattan Project to build atomic bombs. In 2019, Thema and Erin took photographs of the area that is still contaminated, and their interest is really with what we cannot see. So how do we make visible things that are imperceptible to the human eye, such as radioactivity? The rocks that are exhibited in these glass bubbles are very weakly radioactive. And so these bubbles can be considered both as a case protecting us humans, but also preserving the almost like a monument, similar to the shape that you could see in the previous photo. So like a monument to the nuclear histories of Canada and other places. There's a sound work accompanying this work, this piece as well. Carolina Caicedo's water portraits are huge elongated fabrics of 16 meters of length that are hanging down from the ceiling of the space. These water portraits are made with photographs from different bodies of water and land, and the sort of Rorschach mirroring in the center also refers to various visions inspired by medicines in Colombia and other places where Carolina herself is from. And what I find interesting about these water portraits is that they also undo the sort of Western art historical format of landscape, which of course we know the landscape paintings the way that they look, but these are really elongated and sort of blow out that category of what representations of nature look like very often, and also question whether we can actually represent nature and what that does to nature and how it reduces something that cannot be understood or represented in this sense. Here's a work that is not explicitly about water, but I thought it's important to mention because of the connection to sensing. This is an installation titled A Wet Chemical Trace by the artist Miriam Simoun. Miriam has been researching the Agallinis acuta plant, which is a tiny flower with a pink petals that only blooms one day a year for 24 hours. And in 1987, it was declared as being on the verge of extinction and declared an endangered species. But due to a taxonomical error, or because it was qualified wrongly, it's actually a legal fiction. So the protection is somewhat ambivalent for this plant. And the smell emitted by this flower is not detectable to the human nose. Miriam worked together with a company called International Flavors and Fragrances to collect the molecules of the plant and to synthesize them, and then alter them in a way so that the smell is actually detectable to us humans. And in the Biennale, there's vapor being emitted from some of the tubes that you can see. So it's almost like a mad scientist lab where viewers and smellers can actually smell this plant. To me, smell is really interesting and also plays somewhat into the dialectic way of curating, because it speaks to it speaks to a different sense than only the optical. Smell is registered in the same area of the brain where memory and emotions are processed. So that's very interesting to me as well. And the smell molecules are both a sensory offering to visitors, but also an archive of a place, or in this case, a plant at a certain time. Here's some more photos of that installation. And I want to show one last work in the Biennale by Susanne Winterling called Planetary Opera in 3 Acts Divided by the Currents. This installation is an opera made with sounds not by humans, but by all sorts of ocean critters, sea turtles, krill, etc. The green bluish shapes that you can see on this slide are 3D CGI, so computer generated imagery of dinoflagellate algae. These algae bloom, they light up when moved, for example, by a boat or by a swimmer moving through water. And Susanne has referred to them as a touch screen in a way that is an interface between us and our bodies and the worlds of these algae. They're microscopic, so these are enlarged. And I find it really wonderful how Susanne gives space to these critters in the work, and how one of the, formats that is perhaps considered one of the most elaborate formats of Western culture, the opera, is here turned into a non-human format. And I will leave it at that. I'm very happy to show additional images of other exhibitions I've worked with in terms of the ocean previously. But just to add that the way that these exhibitions were presented was really, gently offering you visitors to be immersed in the exhibitions, but also allowing for critical distance and allowing for reflection. So I'm not saying that we should put sensing over analysis and grassroots activism and science, but adding it as an important perspective, which has, at least in the global north, very often been overlooked. And so with this, I will end, and I'm excited to hear Astrida's talk. Thank you.
Hi, Astrida, pass over to you now if you're ready.
Great, thank you. Wow, that was so wonderful to hear you speak about those, Steffi. Thank you. I'd like to begin first by acknowledging that I'm zooming into you this morning for me from the unceded territories of the Silk Okanagan people here in central British Columbia. And I'd like to express my deepest appreciation for all of their labors to the Silk people and their labors in maintaining the lands and waters on which I now live as an uninvited guest. I also want to thank Francesca and Louise for this wonderful opportunity. My talk today is a little bit informal. It's really a great opportunity to have this conversation with Steffi. And, Steffi, I'd also actually like to thank you very publicly, because as a writer, as an academic, I think I'm probably not the only one who has a bit of artist envy, like the idea of being able to collaborate with artists sort of on an equal footing is such a pleasure, and in fact a dream. And it's thanks to the work of people like you, and you particularly inviting me into these circles where I can converse with and collaborate with artists, that has really been transformational in my own practice in writing. So thank you so much. It's really, really amazing. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's just make sure I get this all correct. And share screen. Here we go. Share. There. Hopefully you can see that. So I'm just going to take about 10 minutes first to speak a little bit about, sort of my writing and the sort of grounding questions that have guided my work really for about 20 years now, not quite, maybe 15 years. And then describe a few of the collaborations that I've had the great fortune to work on in the last 2 years. And talk a little bit about what I think about collaboration, because I have the sense that, you know, when we go to galleries or open books and read about or view these amazing collaborations between artists and writers and scientists, sometimes they seem to just, you know, magically be conjured, you know, but as anybody who's been involved with them knows, they are really sweaty labors that can go wrong, and usually do go wrong in all sorts of ways. And so maybe today we can pull back the curtain a little bit, the Wizard of Oz curtain, to look at, you know, maybe the nuts and bolts of collaboration. I'd love to spend a bit of time talking about that. But to begin, so as Francesca mentioned a few years ago, it's not really new anymore. I wrote this book, Bodies of Water, which was a long time in the making. It was an iteration of my PhD thesis that I actually finished in 2008. So, you know, the thinking isn't exactly new. And sometimes when non-academics ask me about it and I describe what it is, i.e., you know, this book length description of how, you know, we are made of water and there's all this water out there in the world. And so we absorb that water and then put it back in the world. You know, sometimes non-academics just say, yeah, duh. You know, it's like, it's not a really complicated thought. Yet the book is premised on the idea that despite the fact that this shared embodied wateriness is such a banal, you know, biological fact, to actually pay attention to it, to sort of open an imaginary based on that fact, in fact, can, or my proposition is that this might lead to new understandings of our environmental obligations to other bodies of water, both human and more than human. So as I've written here on this slide, I'm very curious, and you know, all of my work really is curious about this fact. How might rethinking or reimagining or, you know, resensing, you know, drawing on what Steffi just said, our own material constitution as mostly watery, how can this open to new ways of relating to other bodies and the earth? And so methodologically, I'm interested in how paying close attention to water, so all of the waters, whether they are in our bodies or out in other bodies in the world, how can paying close attention to this, its physical properties, its metaphysics, its sensuous qualities, the value of water across cultures, you know, to water's own poetics, and there we might draw a link to this idea of dialectics from Camille Brathwaite that Steffi already mentioned. Camus Brathwaite, sorry. How can all of this teach us something about feeling, care, and justice in our current era, which is characterized not only by climate catastrophe, but by what I understand as the deformed human relationships that are at the root of climate catastrophe. So in other words, you know, just as Steffi mentioned that her curatorial practice is working towards, you know, answering the question of how we might forge and world, you know, more just futures with, you know, humans and more than humans. My work similarly, you know, is interested in the nexus between social and environmental justices, right? And I don't understand climate catastrophe or, you know, water degradation as a problem in and of itself, but rather as a symptom of things that have broken down amongst us humans in terms of colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, misogyny, you know, hatred of the poor, bodily normativities that, you know, exert themselves very violently. So all of these relations that have broken down, that are not functioning well and in ways that are full of care, that this is what then produces climate catastrophe. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And so looking at bodies of water is my way of trying to get to these questions. Although Bodies of Water was a singly authored work, it's my name on the cover. It, of course, emerged from conversations, with so many others, both textually and in person. And with others, I mean, not only humans, but more than humans, by immersing myself in water, paying attention to bodies of water that I would visit at length, researching waters, researching, deep time waters and speculative future waters, through this kind of deep immersion, like a body itself. I think I sort of sponged up all, various thoughts and speculations and information that I could then, sort of rework in my own body that, emerged as this book. But in more recent years, I've been quite interested in collaboration. Now, I should say that as an academic, as a humanities scholar, I'm not really encouraged to collaborate. There aren't a lot of good models or methods for doing so in the humanities, which, drawing on a Western tradition of philosophical thought or sort of literary thought is perceived as quite a lonely pursuit. The stereotype of the academics sitting in their office, with just, yourself and your computer and your books. This is, true in many ways. That's how many scholars work. So while scientists, have deep histories of collaboration, as do many artists and other kinds of practitioners, writers don't. So I really had to do a lot of experimentation and trying things out and just sort of tentatively extending invitations to collaborate as I accepted them as well, and tried to sort of see what would work, sort of trial by doing. And I've learned a lot about collaboration along the way. So the next slide I want to show you sort of was my attempt to think about what works and what doesn't, and why collaboration works. Particularly when I'm working with scientists and when artists work with scientists, I've had these discussions. There's sometimes, sort of two models where either the scientist becomes the object of study of the artist, who then, transforms their scientific research into an art object. That's one way that sometimes collaboration is seen. Or on the other hand, the scientist wants to deploy the artist, enlist the artist or the writer, the creative writer or the creative nonfiction writer as a science communicator. Like, here's my message to the world, you make it look pretty, make it sound pretty, put it out there so people will listen. And, if you've, even just looking at the slides from Momenta that Steffi showed us, or if you've seen, really good collaborations, you'll see that like neither of those models are really satisfactory, right? Similarly, sometimes we have the kinds of collaborative models that are like compare and contrast, like, traditional knowledge keepers, compared to, Western scientists, often in a good, bad sort of binary or a sensing, knowing binary, which also completely don't hold up, when you actually dig into the work that is being done. So instead of these kind of utilitarian, extractive, or comparative models, what I've been working towards in my collaborations has been sort of what I would consider a multilingualism, right? If we all have different languages for sensing the world, sensing as a form of knowing the world, then how can we, in our collaborations, learn from one another and come up with something that is more than the sum of its parts, right? So what emerges could never be something I could do on my own, just as my collaborators couldn't either. So, understanding that no knowledge is comprehensive, I'm really interested in how putting different forms of knowledge making together, how that can disturb, how those different forms disturb each other and complement each other. So when I think about what makes for a good collaboration, I think an open heart, a curious mind, a willingness to be challenged and shift your own position on something, but also a willingness to sometimes stand your ground and not be intimidated by, sometimes other forms of knowledge that in the Western system seem to be sort of hierarchically superior, for example, scientific knowledge. So So on that, let me spend just a few minutes showing you a couple of the collaborations I've done over the last years. This is a slide from a performance lecture, a video performance lecture that I compiled with Susie Connor, who is the filmmaker and the editor of the film, Dominique Baron-Bonerjee, who is a UK London-based dancer and artist, whose figure you see in the film, and Dr. Adriana Verges of Operation Crayweed, who is a marine biologist and whose footage is the backdrop there of the crayweed, which is located in Little Bay in Sydney, Australia. And so this collaboration, which was shown at the Kelp Congress, Lofoten Biennale in 2019, and since then in a couple of other places, was my attempt to say, okay, I can write a text about kelp and exhaustion and misogyny and sort of gender-based violence and sleep and the inability to sleep and the exhaustion of the sea and the stars and the kelp and all of these things. And I can create a poetic text, but how can that text speak differently and perhaps more capaciously when I pair that with a score that is a movement of a body, a footage of an actual kelp bed, and you know, the sort of filmmaking process that went into that, so that the experience actually became an immersion of one's self, so as the viewer in the exhausted sea. I'm happy to answer more questions about that if I need to. The second thing I want to mention is the piece that I worked on in collaboration with an artist named Claire Britton, who is also based in Sydney, and Auntie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor, who is a Gadigal elder in Sydney as well. And this is a work we worked on together for the Shanghai Biennale, Bodies of Water, which, you know, also because of COVID, its timing got a bit messed up. But this project took place at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, and then it was shown in Shanghai. Documentation was shown in mid-2021. So what Claire and I did was, you know, based on a project that Claire had done around the Cooks River, which is, you know, part of it you can see in the top corner there in its early stages. Claire had done a multi-year-long artistic project, research project on the Cooks River. And based on this really intimate and thorough knowledge she had gathered as an artist, we put together a social art project whereby we would invite a bunch of people to walk with us along the Cooks River at the speed of the tide. So a walk, it's about 17 kilometers from the sort of where the river properly starts, coming out of a little drainage ditch in a golf course. Where it properly starts, we would follow its banks about 17 kilometers to the ocean at the speed of the tide. So it would normally take maybe a couple, 2 or 3 hours. And the tide cycle was actually 8 hours. So we, you know, slowed down and walked 8 hours, paying attention as a river becomes an ocean. And really pivotal in this collaboration was also the work of Auntie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor, whose, you know, traditional lands and waters these are. And Auntie Rhonda, you know, opened the walk and you know, invited us all to commence and embark on this collective, you know, project together over the next 8 hours, thinking about how beautiful this place must have been. You know, that's a quote from Claire's work, actually, but remembering what these lands and waters have been, how they've changed, and through an act of slow collective attention, could we, you know, also engage in an act of caring for country that, while damaged and disturbed, is certainly not dead. So that was the walk. And then you can see in the bottom corner there, documentation of it that was shown in Shanghai. And then finally, I'm just going to say a couple of words about my most recent project, which is with LA artist Patty Chang, my sister Alexia Neimanis, who is a veterinary pathologist and marine biologist, and myself. we've been working on this for about 8 months together. And we are getting into research on the practice of necropsy, which is what Alexia does when, as a pathologist, when marine mammals, I mean other animals, but we focus particularly on porpoises and whales. When these mammals are stranded or washed up dead, Alexia's place of work, which is the Veterinary Academy of Sweden, you know, they go and they pick up these animals and they perform a necropsy to find out why these animals died. So Patty and I were interested in learning from Alexia about this practice of necropsy. So because of COVID, we couldn't visit. We live streamed many of these necropsies in the middle of the night, you know, in my time zone and Patty's time zone, and watched Alexia carry out this practice as she, you know, narrated what she was doing. And I mean, there's so much I could say about this project that has been, you know, now commissioned by the Ho Foundation, and we're going to, you know, turn it into a public piece. But why I mention it here is because one of the surprising outcomes of it, and that actually turned out to be a pivotal, you know, piece of information, was that through Patty and I, as, you know, as sort of creative thinkers, watching and reflecting back to Alexia about what she was doing in the necropsy room, Alexia reported that it really changed the way she thought about what she did. And, you know, we sort of suggested to her that what she was doing was a practice of care for the dead. And although Alexia completely agreed with us, you know, in her sort of scientific milieu, she was not encouraged really to think about her work that way. Yet once she was given the opportunity to, it really opened up a whole new relationship to her work. And then as we interviewed other scientists who perform necropsies, we saw this, you know, this connection across their narratives about the emotional, the care labor, and the, you know, the care for the animal and the oceans from which they come, you know, that is often sort of backgrounded in the scientific work. So, and that's sort of what we're going to try to bring out in the project. You know, in a way, what the project is doing is suggesting that while the scientist cares for the animal and the oceans, the artist has a role in caring for the scientist to enable them to do their work. So, you know, I'll leave it there, a little bit of, I guess, just sort of suspense, you know, what will come out of it, wait and see. And I'll stop sharing my screen and we can have a bit of a chat now.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Thank you both, Stefanie and Astrida, for that. Really fascinating to hear about. Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear about your recent projects as well. It's great to see what you're up to. So you've got about 20 minutes for any questions and conversations you want to have. So if our audience wants to put them into the chat box, you're very welcome to. I would like to start, if that's okay. I think based on this kind of question of care that you just mentioned there, I find it really interesting, this relationship between water as a subject and a methodology or a kind of practice and a way of thinking. And I think you both do this in different ways, either through kind of dialectic curation or this idea of collaboration. I was wondering if you could extend this to kind of queer and feminist theory, because obviously this is something that you're both very much part of as well, and perhaps draw on this connection between water and a kind of watery way of thinking and gender and sexuality. It's a huge question, but I thought maybe somewhere to start.
That's great. If you don't mind, Steffi, I'll jump in and start with an answer and then toss it to you. I have many answers to this question since I've written about it so much. I love the way that you framed that question, Francesca, as, you know, water as a method, you know, or a methodology. And that is definitely where, you know, I'm coming from in a way. You know, water is less an object of study or an object of research for me than it is a way, than it is a teacher, right? So when I talk about my work, I speak about thinking with water more than thinking about water. so that water teaches me ways of being in the world that then I can follow up in my own writing and collaborative practice. So water as something that flows between bodies, that connects bodies, that is shared by all bodies, but in our embodiment of it, we are all different. So water is also something that differentiates. And I mean, just, I suppose, very quickly, I would add that when I started the project, Bodies of Water, back, 15 years ago, I didn't actually think I would be writing about water. I was a feminist philosopher, and I was studying feminist embodied philosophies and phenomenologies particular, whose, it's hard to sort of summarize them all, but I would say a common thread through many embodied feminist phenomenologies is the myth of the discrete atomized human body that is, self-sufficient, zipped up in this skin that then just can sort of autonomously move through the world. Feminist theories were very much, through their, underlining of things like, childbirth, lactation, placental transfer, but also sex, right? We're constantly reminding us of the ways that our bodies are porous and constantly sharing themselves, with the world. And, environmental justice scholarship then literalizes that by showing how, as porous, we also take in, toxins in our bodily waters, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of like, I started in feminist philosophy, and then, I turned to look at, environmental questions and saw that, again, that's just the way the world works. That is what water is embodying. Water manifests that feminist philosophy in a very literal way. And so starting from that feminist theory of interdependence and relation rather than independence and separation, that's sort of what got me started on this whole trajectory. So I see a very clear sort of connection there. I could say more, but I'm going to pass it to Steffi.
This is great, thank you. I mean, to me, water, and also the way that I spoke about it in terms of Kamau breathwork, really allows us to undo certain borders and boundaries, right? Like continental philosophies and ways of thinking based in land are very much about, dialectics, or this is where the term dialectics comes from, right? It's a word play on the term dialectics, proposing that our thinking is much more influenced by the tides. And so this fluidity and uncertainty to me is a very queer position, right? Where we can't take anything for granted. Things are not always the way, or the way they are today. It does not mean that this is the way they will be tomorrow. And for me, realizing that has actually been incredibly liberating, to know that, or to find ways of grappling, with the uncertainties that we live in, with queerness, but also with the environmental disaster that we're living in, right? So obviously the philosophies deriving from the Holocene do not hold today. And so to me, water is really a way to acknowledge that and to work through that. And obviously it's very symbolic too, with rising sea levels, with coastal floodings, with melting ice. So all of these sorts of changes to our lands, to our ways of thinking and having to cope with, or our ways of living having to change to be able to cope with this, as well as, thinking about and actually working actively towards undoing these sorts of binaries and the very harm that gender binaries and naturalizations of sex and sexuality and all of this has provoked, to me, connects really closely to water.
I was at an artist talk some months ago, and it's terrible that unfortunately, I don't remember the artist's name, somebody who's working in BC right now, who when asked what their, how do you understand your gender? And their answer was water. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which was just pretty brilliant.
That's beautiful.
We've got a question from Vera, who's asked this for Astrida, but perhaps Stefanie, you might have something to answer this as well. It's where and how do you draw the boundaries in collaboration in order to prevent writers, scientists becoming writers or visual artists and vice versa, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, I saw that question. Thanks, Vera. Hi, how are you? Not that you can answer. That's a great question. And it's so interesting that you phrase it as, that would prevent them from becoming, right? Like, as though this is like a danger that we might cross, unintentionally, breach the boundaries of our discipline. Because of course, disciplines are a little bit artificial to begin with, right? Like, we're trained in them, but disciplines only exist because we've said this is what they are. There's no sort of natural boundary to a discipline. And as somebody myself who was trained really without a discipline, my undergraduate degree was in gender studies, so was my master's, my PhD was in social and political thought. I was never actually trained as a disciplinarian like other colleagues of mine have been. So I've always been sort of perplexed by the question of discipline and perplexed by this perceived risk of crossing it. But I do understand the value of your question, right? And I suppose I would answer it, by thinking about how we've been working with Patty and Alexia and I. So as I mentioned, Alexia has said that her practice as a scientist has really not changed, but she's come to understand it differently through the work we've been doing with her. And we had this one moment where, there's this thing that Alexia does before every necropsy now, where she, goes by herself into the freezer with the animal and puts her hand on the animal and just spends some time with it and documents it for the project with a photograph or a little video. And, Patty suggested, that this experience is somehow, outside of her practice as a scientist, right? And, Alexia's response was, well, maybe not. Like, maybe it's an expansion of my role as a scientist. So maybe it's not so much about crossing out of the scientist role into something like, an arts-based practice, and more it's like, what if we understood science more capaciously to include these acts of care that could be part of a arts practice-based archive, So I think your question is, begs another question, which is, what do we want to do? Do we want to preserve those boundaries? And, boundaries are useful in all sorts of ways, right? Otherwise, we're just one big amorphous slot all over the place. So we need boundaries, but do we want to preserve them very strongly? Or could sometimes collaboration allow us to expand the territory of those disciplines so that they're more overlapping as concentric circles and more fluid and moving in and out of each other? That's what I see happening in my collaborations, more than a sort of reaffirmation of hard and fast boundaries. That said, we do have very interesting conversations where, for example, Patty and I want to do something and Alexia counters with, no, I would not be comfortable doing that as a scientist, right? So, we do actually have to engage in a lot of, deliberation and sort of consensus building when our practices and sort of the methods that we use, the kinds of validity benchmarks that we use for our data, when those clash, we have to really sort of negotiate that. And so that's been super interesting.
I would, I couldn't agree more. And I really like the idea, Astrida, of considering the interdisciplinary as an expansion of various disciplines. I also think it is key to have time. You mentioned time earlier, and a sort of slow learning and slowly engaging with one another and actually getting to know one another's way of thinking and doing. And from there to see what actually makes sense, right? Not everything needs to be a collaboration, but also the arts have changed so much, even just within the last 20 years. And if you look, of course, at, 100 years ago, what was considered art and the discipline of art is very, very different. So today, somebody working with cetaceans, and having this sort of practice can indeed be an artist. And in Momenta, we are working with Maryse Goudreau, who's a wildlife rehabilitator and obsessed with beluga whales, and whose practice of working with the whales is also part of her art or for artistic practice. So there's, even within our own lives, I mean, we're very complex, complicated beings, right? And we're not ever only one thing. So in this sense, I think that through these sorts of conversations, like long-term conversations and in-depth conversations, a lot of things can happen. And it doesn't always work out either. You know, sometimes a collaboration starts and you realize that it just doesn't make sense. And that's okay too. You know, the kind of failure, especially within these experimental formats, it's it's important. And then I can say about Momenta that you know, it was very organic, the kind of collaboration. And this is actually the way that I really love working, where after a while you realize, you know, what can we each contribute to the project, and what is my expertise, where am I comfortable, where am I willing to also step outside of my comfort zone, guided by my collaborators. And we also really, and this has been an incredible experience, because we really had each other's backs. And this, I have to say, especially in the art world, is so important. And for me, I don't want to make exhibitions about, you know, environmental and social justice, but I want to practice and actually deeply embody what we're talking about. And so in this collaboration, I feel this was really the case, you know, where we helped each other out. Somebody, you know, had a bad month, somebody else would step in. And it's very basic, very human sorts of values that I think are incredibly important. And we shouldn't forget that, you know, it's not only the sort of outcome or what we present, but also everything that happens in the background.
Just building on that, I think I can't see any other questions in the chat, but I've got one to finish off if no one else has one. I guess it's the kind of ultimate question, really. Stefanie, you mentioned kind of lots of different types of practices, like including like obviously the multisensory, but also humor and this idea of putting representation into question. And Astrida, your collaborations are going, you know, beyond representation in many ways as well. So there's a kind of broad range of what you think kind of art can do and what art is, and that's very much evident. And I guess my question is kind of what do you think that art can do as a medium for raising environmental awareness, and within this kind of tackling, you know, the ecological crisis more generally, but perhaps other mediums cannot, you know, kind of, yeah, why art for this conversation, I guess, is my question.
I can, if you like, I can start, and Astrida, you can finish. But you know, I really love your slides where you had crossed out these different things, and you know, art, of course, you know, some forms of art can of course help to communicate, right, and to communicate in a different, more effective way what we're experiencing. But I do think that the most relevant kind of contribution is also not to solve any sort of crisis or to come up with solutions, right? But it is indeed to offer different perspectives and to be speculative, and, you know, to make us see things differently, and to be undisciplined in a way too, you know, to experiment in a way that we cannot do in many other disciplines. I mean, in science, you can of course be very experimental too, and there are many other disciplines, fluid boundary disciplines that are able to do this kind of experimentation. But I do, at least myself, I find myself most at home within the arts. And I really think that through conversations with artists and through especially these kinds of long-term projects, we can find different perspectives for different futures.
Yeah, it's such a big question. And as somebody who's not an artist nor a curator, I'm tentatively thinking about my response because I don't know what art is. But if you will indulge me, you know, I think I am drawn to working with artists because from my limited understanding, I like that art tends to be experimental, you know, and begin often with the material. So it's like myself as a theorist, I'm a phenomenologist, which, you know, really means you go back to you go to the world itself to sort of test things and try things out. It's not a practice of sort of thinking big thoughts and then leaving it up to others to see if they work in the world or not. But you're sort of testing things out in the world all the time as a phenomenologist, and which is something I think I've noticed is, you know, generally a way of doing art practice as well. So I'm really drawn to this, this kind of commitment to a groundedness in the world, to experimentation, to seeing what works and what doesn't. And ultimately, you know, when it works, there's not really a formula for when it works. And I say this about the artists I work with, but also about my own writing practice, I think, as sort of taking up a similar kind of method. It's like, does it make you feel, right? Which I think art can do, and what we need so desperately in the time of climate catastrophe and its attendant social catastrophes. We really need to feel deeply, but also, oh my gosh, I just lost my thought, but so this idea that, you know, if art can make us feel something, then that is what I think it can give as a language that perhaps other disciplines might not. I had a really good point. Hopefully it will come back to me probably as I'm sleeping tonight. Yeah, you know, I'm drawn to the way that artists offer us a different language, a different embodied language for understanding how we feel about what is happening in the world, and also what we can do about those feelings.
I really think you do that in your writing too. You know, you always, to me, evoke this sort of feeling and a sort of scenery from which one can, you know, learn about what you write about through a totally different way than only the cognitive, which I think is so important. Not to say that it's either or, but just to say that it adds so much to, yeah, to learning.
Right. And I did remember what I was going to say at that point, but you triggered my memory of it, Steffi. It's that, you know, I think what I love about art and sort of writing that goes in that direction is its honesty, you know? And by that, I don't mean like truth or objective truth. I mean this honesty where what you are sort of confronted with in the gallery or on the page just feels honest. It might be messy and complicated and confusing. It might not be sewn up in a neat narrative or, you know, nicely in a labeled pie graph, you know, that's very coherent, but it feels honest. And I think right now, you know, again, in a time where we have so much conflict and tension and disagreement and, you know, not being able to sort of find modes of connection the way we need to, you know, we need to return to that ground of being honest, you know, with ourselves, each other, and the world. And I think art does that.
There's a certain openness. I mean, what you were saying about the messiness, there's a certain, you know, like these kind of gaps and frictions and tensions within artworks that don't give answers, right? But that can evoke other ways of, other perspective. And I also would add vulnerability, because if, you know, every time you're experimental and you put something out in the world, you don't know if it's going to work. And I think this is such an important way of engaging, especially at this moment, where it's not about saying, oh, I have the best answer and this is how we should do things, but where it is really about, you know, in a very honest, sincere way to try and find, you know, perspectives that may somewhat alleviate the situation we're in, and go like trickle deep down into the structures.
Yes.
I could listen to you both talk about this for a long time, but sadly time is up. Thank you both of you for joining us. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have. But yes, hopefully you can also join us for our next talk, which is next Friday on the 24th, with Janet Lawrence and Wan-Chen Chang on humanities within natural history. That's at 10 a.m. as well, BST. But yeah, a huge thank you, Stefanie and Astrida, for this.
Thank you, Astrida, and Louise and Francesca for organizing, and everyone for joining and for your questions.
Yes,
absolutely. Thank you.
But yeah, I'll leave it there. Yes, see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.